First, you need to put your truck on jack stands and remove the wheel of whatever side you're working on. We are going to start with the driver's side first. Once that's removed and out of the way, look for these two bolts. One is an 8mm and the other is a 10mm. Those need to be removed to give yourself some slack in the ABS line. This is your IWE vacuum line, which will need to be disconnected from the IWE. Oh, and in case you were wondering, IWE stands for Integrated Wheel End. This line runs from your ABS wheel speed sensor in your wheel bearing up this way to the top of the wheel liner, and we will remove that later in the video. And yes, if you purchase new wheel bearings, they do come with this line, so you don't have to remove the sensor itself. Let's start with a 10mm bolt that holds the brake hose bracket in place. This will give you plenty of room to push that brake caliper out of the way after removing it. Alright, that bolt is off and now you should be able to pull the bracket out. Do you see this part of the bracket that extends out? This helps hold the line in place when we put everything back together. I'll show you what I mean later in the video. Push that out of the way and then get ready to disconnect the bolt for the ABS line. This is an 8mm. For this bolt, I'm going to use an open-ended wrench. You can use a socket, however, it's difficult to get one in there because of how close this rubber clamp is to the bolt. Once that is free, the line will have more slack in it just like this. You can remove the rest, but I'm going to stop there because I don't want the line to constantly get in the way while I'm working. Let's get this cap removed so we can have access to the axle nut. Most people use a flathead and jam it into the sides of the cap. However, I'm going to show you how to remove it with channel locks. I'm going to be installing a new cap, but if you need to reuse yours, this is a better way of removing the cap compared to jamming a flathead into the side. You want to keep moving around the cap while rocking the channel locks back and forth. Eventually, the cap will come loose and pop right out. Just like that. This is an old cap, and as you can tell, the inside edge has zero damage, so it can be reused again. The outside has some dents in it from the channel locks, but that's okay. This is in great shape to be reused. However, caps are cheap, and I decided to replace them anyway. So here are the caps, and the part number for my truck is 9L1Z1131A. I believe these can be used for a wide variety of F150s that have four-wheel drive. Now let's remove that axle nut. This is a 13mm bolt, and I recommend using a deep socket like this so you don't hit the wheel studs while turning your wrench. Also, the wheel tends to turn with the axle nut as you are trying to loosen it, so I recommend hitting your wrench with the palm of your hand a few times in the counterclockwise direction. This should loosen it a little at a time until you can grab the top of the rotor to hold it in place as you loosen the nut the rest of the way. Eventually, it will loosen to the point where you can unscrew it by hand and remove it, just like that. You will notice the inside nut has red Loctite on the threads. Make sure your new nut has it too, as this will prevent the nut from loosening over time, which could cause severe damage to parts around this area. So, here are the new axle nuts. The kit comes with 2 of them. And the part number for my truck is N802827S100A4X. Now let's move on and get the caliper out of the way. I'm going to remove the caliper as one unit by removing these 2 bolts for the caliper mounting bracket. These are 21mm. Make sure you start with the lower bolt first, or else the caliper will move too much at the top, making it difficult to keep it stable while removing the bottom bolt due to the weight of the caliper. Once that's removed, we can move on to the top bolt. Now you do not want to completely remove this bolt until you find an area to rest the caliper, or until you are ready to mount the caliper out of the way safely without it dangling from the brake hose. I took mine out and screwed it back in until I was ready. I used these bungee cords to start, but quickly found out I needed something a little more stable to keep pressure off of that brake hose. You will see that in a bit. So I rested the caliper on the top of the hub and removed the rotor. Make sure you rest the rotor on something soft if you plan on reusing them. Now back to hanging the caliper. This would definitely be easier with caliper hooks, or if there's another person available to hold it while you feed a bungee or rope around it. Here is how it looks at this stage. As you can see, with this bracket detached from the mounting point, we have enough slack in the brake hose to push the caliper as far back as possible. This gives us plenty of room to get to the parts we need to remove. But I do not like the way the caliper looks with one bungee cord. So here is a revision I did off camera. As you can see, I have both of these hooks securing the caliper to the sway bar back here. This provides plenty of support as it does not move very much. Now let's remove the tie rod nut so our hub can freely move side to side. This is a 21mm. You might as well remove it all the way with your socket wrench or your impact, because it would be too difficult to remove by hand due to the Loctite used from the factory. Once that's out of the way, you can grab a sledgehammer or a regular hammer and start hitting right here. This should technically help break the tie rod free. However, as you can see, my tie rod wanted to be a little difficult. I was hitting it with some decent force too, but the bushing would not break free. I even tried hitting this part of the tie rod, which you should never do as it can twist the rod and cause damage to the bushing. And you also don't want to hit the bottom like this because that could mushroom the end and make it difficult to get that nut back on. So I stopped with the risky methods and decided to try something different. I grabbed some penetrating fluid and sprayed right here where the bushing meets the hub. I also sprayed the threads underneath the knuckle, however, I'm not sure that did a lot. The fluid on top I believe was the most helpful. I'm going to let that soak in for a bit, but I want you to take note of the wheel position. Now the wheel is turned the other way as I needed more access to these bolts. I'll show you why that is important in a second. Let's get those IWE bolts removed. These are 8mm. After that's removed, you can move on to the second of the 3 IWE bolts. But wait, now the tie rod is popped out of place. I believe it popped when I turned the wheel when trying to access that IWE bolt. Let's get the other 2 IWE bolts out of the way. This is where both of them are located, and remember they are 8mm. That's the second bolt. And there's the third. Now you have to pull the vacuum line out of the IWE and it's completely free. Well, sort of. You can see the axle move, but the IWE is stuck due to all the rust. So I grabbed my sledgehammer again and gave it a few taps. You can see the rust flying off the bat with each hit. Now the IWE is free from the hub. So we should be able to pull it straight out now, right? Well, not quite. You can't just pull back on the CV axle and remove the IWE. As you can see right here, it doesn't pull back far enough. It doesn't matter how hard you try to push it away from the hub, it is not possible to remove. So, you need to remove the upper control arm nut so you can move the hub away from the axle. You'll see what I mean shortly. Removing this nut was not very easy for me. Oh, and you definitely need to buy new nuts to replace these like I had to. More on that in a bit. This nut is a 21mm, and if you have an air gun, I would definitely use that. Just make sure you spin that nut off as quickly as possible without stopping, or else you will run into the same issue I did. I even tried to use my battery operated impact on the passenger side, however I still ran into issues. If you do what I'm doing, at some point the bolt that goes through the bushing will start spinning with the nut. That's not good, but I did find out what needs to be done in order to get them separated. At the bottom right here, you can use a socket to hold that bolt in place. I believe mine was 10mm. Then you can grab a 21mm open-ended wrench and begin loosening the nut. I'm using channel locks, which you can use to get this done. However, I would definitely recommend using a 21mm open-ended wrench. After removing the nut, the sides were in rough shape. If you are replacing yours, which you should, then it doesn't matter what you use to remove it. At some point, you won't have to hold both wrenches, as you can see here. The bottom wrench is pushing against the spring in the back as I'm turning the nut with the channel locks. While this does help, I still had a hard time turning the nut, so I decided to try something else. I grabbed my electric impact and tried to spin the nut off, but the whole thing just spun together. Then I tried to use a crowbar. First I pried up, which was the wrong way, and again, the nut would not break free. Next, I pried the correct way by putting downward pressure on the control arm. This did not work, but I did notice the control arm wasn't pressing down as much as I expected. So I thought if I adjusted where the jack stands were, maybe this would help me get the right amount of pressure onto the control arm to help me remove that nut. As you can see, the jack stand was right here holding the whole hub assembly up. Watch the hub assembly drop as I relocate the jack stand. Now with the jack stand back here, the hub will drop several more inches. At the time, I thought this was going to help. I was also wrong again for the 19th time. Oh, and if you are interested in a 2-in-1 jack and jack stand like this one right here, I'll leave the information for it in the description below. I've been using this one for years and it makes working on my truck a lot easier. It's smaller than a regular floor jack and doubles as a jack stand with its locking bracket. And no, I am not sponsored by this company, I just really like this jack. However, if Powerbuilt wants to collab, I guess we could do so. Moving on. Remember when I said this wasn't going to work? Well, here's the footage. No matter how much downward force I applied, the nut was not budging. So I caved and decided to get some heat. I bought this torch and it worked like a charm. However, it did take some time to get it hot enough to remove. Also, using the impact did not work. Just watch this. Even while I was applying a lot of force, the nut would not budge enough. And this wasn't a situation where the nut just wasn't hot enough. As you can see, I tried this several times and it did not come off. So I had to go back to the wrench and channel lock method, and this worked perfectly. There was still resistance while trying to unscrew it, but I was finally able to completely remove it. Here's the nut. These are also known as an insulator nut, and the reason for that is because they come with a plastic ring at the end to help keep the bolt from backing out. Here's a picture of a brand new nut from Ford. See that red ring at the end? That's what I'm referring to. That plastic piece is what makes removing that upper control arm nut so difficult. It's also why I was able to remove it after using heat, because I essentially melted the plastic and unscrewed it before it cooled off and became solid again. Let's keep going. Next, you want to get that ABS line loose and disconnected so you can completely remove the wheel bearing. So grab some kind of clip removal tool like this one and disconnect the line right here. Now on the center edge of your fender well, you will notice two white pins sticking out. You need to push these in or pull down on the electrical connector behind it just like that. There is a red tab you need to push out before you can disconnect. So grab your clip removal tool again, or even push it out with a fingernail if you can. Then you can disconnect the connector by pressing on this tab right here and then pulling them apart, just like that. The tab is right under this red clip. All you do is press down, pretty simple. Then you want to feed this wire through or pull it out of this area, and the only thing it should be connected to at this point is the wheel bearing. Now I did not get this on camera, but you need to disconnect the IWE vacuum line. That's simple, you just need to pull it right off. Nothing else to it. Since the upper control arm is disconnected from the hub assembly, you can easily pull it towards you like this and then push the IWE and CV axle to free them. Then the IWE should easily slide off of the CV axle like this. Let's take a closer look at that IWE. A good IWE will allow you to push the face in without restriction. Part of it will push in, but as you can see right here, this part will not. This tells me the IWE failed, which makes sense because of the noise I was hearing. This outer edge does not look like it held up well, meaning it could have let in moisture and debris. That seems to be the point of failure. It's quite odd that Ford still uses this design considering how many issues it presents to its customers, but that's a discussion for another video. Alright, let's grab the new IWE and compare it to the old one to make sure we have the right one. As you can see, it comes pre-greased from Ford, which is great. Also, it comes with new IWE 8mm bolts and a new axle nut. That's convenient, and it also means I need to run back to Ford to return the two axle nuts that I bought individually because I did not know this kit came with new ones. However, keep that in mind if you plan on replacing these. Now, this is as simple as putting both IWEs right next to each other and making sure they are exactly the same. You want to keep an eye on the nipples that the vacuum line mounts to, as well as the 3 tabs that the bolt screws in to hold the IWE in place. As I mentioned earlier, these things are greased up pretty good from the factory, so you don't have to worry about that. However, I will be adding more. One last thing before we continue. Take a look at how freely the new one presses down. There's definitely a difference. Now, if you were just replacing the IWE, you need to wipe down this end of the axle to remove the old grease. This is important because the old grease probably has a lot of dirt and other debris stuck in there that you really want to clean up to prevent from damaging your brand new IWE. I'm replacing my axle, but I still wanted to mention that. Now grab your grease and you're going to want to apply it to the wheel bearing and your CV axle. Your new IWE will be sandwiched between these two parts, and since it already comes greased from Ford, you don't need to apply a lot of grease. Just a coating over the ends to ensure everything stays greased up while in operation. Once that's done, you can grab your IWE and make sure it's in the correct orientation. You want the nipples to face towards the vehicle, not out like you see here. Watch what happens when you have it facing the wrong way. 2 things. First, it would be difficult to connect the vacuum line to the nipples. And secondly, you won't be able to mount it because the 3 8mm bolts will not be able to reach the hub with the IWE out this far. So pull it back out. Mount the IWE properly and then push it back together. Okay, so while you are working on the next step, you need to find a way to keep the hub assembly from falling towards you. Since that upper control arm nut is out, it will naturally fall forward. So you can use a bungee, or you can temporarily put that nut back on the upper control arm ball joint to hold it into place. Now, grab some thread locker and apply it to each of the 3 bolts before you start screwing them in. Again, this is a high vibration area, and you don't want these bolts to back out. Then grab your 8mm socket and your torque wrench. Now I read online these need to be torqued down to 133 inch-pounds. However, my Chilton's manual reads 108 inch-pounds. So I'm going with 108 inch-pounds for now. If I need to go to 133, then I can always tighten them later. I don't want to risk going higher and being wrong, as this could break the bolts. Oh, and make sure you are using inch-pounds and not foot-pounds. 108 foot-pounds would definitely break them. The first two bolts, I'm going to just get them flush with the IWE. Then the third bolt I will torque down and do the same with the other two. When torquing down, you want to go slow. If you try to speed through it with a smaller torque wrench like this, it may not register, and then you could end up over torquing the bolts. There's one. There's two. And let's move over to the other side and torque the third bolt down. Just like that. Alright, let's move on to the upper control arm nut. You need to use a pry bar or something similar to allow you to press the control arm down like this. This gives you the leverage needed to line up the hub assembly and get that nut screwed on. As I stated near the beginning of this video, it is required to replace this nut on both sides due to that red plastic piece that melted off when I was using a torch. I am installing the old ones, but I had to go back to 4 to get new nuts to replace later on. Make sure the pry bar is secure and doesn't come out like mine just did. Luckily, this did not cause any damage or injury, but it can fly out, so just be careful. With the pry bar secure against the spring, I was able to easily pull down and then screw the nut on. Once you feel the nut is threaded enough, go ahead and remove the bungee if you used one. Now we can tighten the nut. Ford calls for this to be torqued down to 85 foot-pounds. However, that would be quite difficult to do since I don't have a 21mm open-ended wrench, so I'm just going to use my impact. Plus, I need to replace this bolt with a new one anyway. If you have a 21mm open-ended wrench, you need to wedge it up against the hub assembly right here while it's on the nut. Then you should be able to use a torque wrench with a socket and tighten from the bottom. I think that would be the best way to tackle that, but if you have a different idea, let me know in the comments and I'll add it to the description. Next, we need to grab one of our new axle nuts and begin screwing it onto the end of the axle that's poking through the center of the wheel bearing. Now we need to torque this nut down to 30 foot-pounds. While you are turning the axle nut, you will notice at some point the bearing begins to turn also, just like this. Now some people I've watched online will use a pry bar and wedge it between the wheel studs to keep it from moving. I personally don't like this idea because, as you may have guessed, you could damage the threads on the studs. So I decided to hold on to the studs while using a torque wrench with one hand. If you are unable to do this, you can ask someone to hold it, or if you have no other choice and need to use something like a pry bar, just make sure you wrap the threads completely with a towel, like a microfiber, to hopefully prevent any damage to the wheel studs. That can be done if you are very careful, but avoid it if you can. Alright, let's move on to something that is not necessary at all. I'm going to grab some grease and apply a decent amount around the axle nut. I'm not sure if I read somewhere this needed to be done, or if I was just used to doing it on older vehicles like my OBS F150, but I do know this can help keep moisture out, so I figured why not. Once that's done, we can move on to installing the cap. This is fairly simple, however, you need to pay attention to how you install it. You want to make sure it's perfectly straight before you start hammering it into place. You can use a mallet or a hammer, it doesn't really matter. Just make sure it's straight, or else you may damage the inside edge, which would make it difficult for it to securely stay in place. This is how it should look when it's installed correctly. Now we just need to clean it up a bit and then we can move on. Perfect, just like that. We will get to the rotor in a second, but I want to mention now is a good time to put thread locker on the caliper bolts. If you try to do this while holding the caliper in place, you will find it quite difficult. These calipers are heavy and will move around on you, so it's best to be prepared before you get to it. Alright, let's apply our anti-seize to the hub surface to prevent the rotor from sticking the next time we have to remove it. You just want a light coat and do not add any to the wheel studs. If you get some on them, just wipe it off with a rag or a towel. Once that's completely covered, you can grab your rotor and push it over the wheel studs. Then grab your anti-seize again and apply it to this part of the rotor. You do not want to get any on the surface that your brake pads touch. This will make it difficult to stop, as you can imagine. Again, just a light coat is all you need. And if you get any on the wheel studs like I did, just go ahead, like I said earlier, wipe it off. Alright, now we need to get that caliper back on. Make sure you put one lug nut on to help keep the rotor in place to make this easier. I'll show you what I mean. Oh, and do not press on the surface of the rotor or else you will get anti-seize everywhere. As you can see, trying to keep that rotor pressed back while installing the caliper is a chore. You really need to use two hands to handle the caliper, which is why screwing on one lug nut is such a convenient idea. It will prevent that rotor from moving, which is exactly what you want. Eventually, I was able to get the caliper lined up with the bracket and started threading the bolts in. Remember, if you haven't added thread locker to these bolts yet, make sure you do so. Once they are threaded in, you can torque these down to 184 foot-pounds. I just use my impact to tighten these bolts because I'm pretty sure my torque wrench is broken or needs to be recalibrated. Now we can connect that 10mm bolt for our brake hose bracket. Then grab your 10mm socket and snug it down. Just like that. Next is your ABS line. So grab that and see if it reaches the bracket that it screws into. If it doesn't, like mine, then it's snagged onto something and you need to free it. Mine was snagged on the brake dust shield. Once I was able to free it, it gave me just enough slack to get that 8mm bolt finger tight. Then you can grab your socket and snug it down. Now you can grab the wire and connect it to the connector up top. After it's connected, go ahead and push in those two white clips through the fender liner just like this. Alright, so as you can see, the footage is rather dark at this angle, so I'm just going to fast forward this part and then I will show you exactly where the wire needs to be clipped into. Now as I grab the camera, you will see the first clip gets pushed into this bracket and the other clip gets pushed in right here. This is how the wire should look, but you can also take a picture of the stock setup before starting this job so you can use it as a reference. Let's move on and get that tie rod nut back on. Just grab your tie rod and then maneuver the hub assembly to allow the tie rod end to slot into place. Just like that. Make sure you add some thread locker onto the threads too. Then grab your 21mm deep socket and torque this nut down to 85 foot-pounds. Now we can reconnect the IWE vacuum hose. Take note, there are two different size holes in the hose as you can see right here. This is to prevent you from putting it on in reverse. So go ahead and push it on. Then grab the clip for the hose right here and push it into the bracket just like this. That helps keep the hose in place so it doesn't move too much while driving. You can now put your wheel back on. Make sure you tighten the lug nuts in a crisscross pattern and then torque them down to 125 foot-pounds. Finally, you can lower your truck and then turn the wheel all the way to the left if you plan on working on the passenger side next.
That's all there is to it. If you found any part of this video helpful or entertaining, please give it a thumbs up. Also, if you haven't subscribed yet, hit that button as well as the notification bell so you don't miss a video from our channel. Thanks for watching and we'll see you on the next one.